All right, so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, all right? There is this perfect relationship that humanity has with God, that creation has with God. It is untainted and perfect, all right? It is the best possible scenario for humanity. Perfect communion with God. However, we know that along the way, there is a tree in the garden that Adam and Eve exist in. This tree they were told not to touch. It had forbidden fruit. I will say this, I don't believe that this tree was anything special or mystical or anything like that. I simply think it was a tree that God said don't touch. It was an act, it was supposed to reveal an act of obedience. And so you have this tree that they're not supposed to touch, but then there is a serpent. Later on we find that the serpent was Satan himself that comes in and deceives Adam and Eve, tricking them into believing that if they were to eat from the fruit, then they become like God himself. And so they, in their rebellion, disobey God because they desired to be like God himself. And in this moment, sin now comes into the world. When sin comes into the world, it ends up destroying this perfect creation, this perfect union that creation has with God, and now everything has been infected by sin. Not only is creation affected, but ultimately humanity is affected. So that now the life that was once within us and the perfect relationship that we had with God is now broken, and now there is deadness within us, so that now everybody that comes from the line of Adam and Eve is born with a sinful nature. Okay? It's important to understand that you do not sin, you are sinful. It is part of who you are, and all of us that have come from Adam and Eve now have this sinful nature within us. Ultimately, we cannot have a relationship with God because of our sin, because God cannot be in the presence of sin, and so now we are disconnected from him. That unity that we once had is completely gone. Now, in this moment, all those that would come from Adam and Eve would be living with this sin, but there was also no law that God had yet given. There was no list of do's and don'ts, and so man pretty much did as they pleased, which created much evil, much wickedness, and it would be at this time that you're going to begin to see stories like Noah, where God exacts judgment upon the wicked, upon the sinful. But then eventually another guy would come along, and his name was Abraham. Now, Abraham was a man of great faith, and God would create a covenant with Abraham and tell Abraham that I will bless the nations through you. All right? And so God promises Abraham that your children and your children's children, through your line, the nations would be blessed, that the world will be blessed through you and your lineage. And so here we have now the lineage of Abraham. Abraham would eventually have a son named Isaac, all right? The relationship between Abraham and Isaac is a very interesting one. There's one story in particular that tends to freak people out. It is a horrendous, horrifying story where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, and Abraham, who is obviously just completely disturbed by this, desires to be obedient to God, and so he takes Isaac up to a mountain where he is going to sacrifice him to God. But then God stops him and says, do not harm your son. God is against human sacrifice. And so Abraham in this moment stops, but it was a test ultimately. God was testing Abraham to see the level of his faithfulness. And in this moment, when God tells him to stop, God says to Abraham, now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your son, your one and only son, from me. Isaac would eventually have a son named Jacob. Jacob would eventually have a son named Joseph. Now Joseph, you may know, is eventually sold into slavery to the Egyptians. All right? But through the providence of God, he is raised up out of slavery and becomes one of the most powerful men in all of Egypt. Now, during this time, there would also be a huge famine that would take place in the land. And there were a vast number of people that were starving, and many of them were coming to Egypt, specifically to Joseph, looking for assistance, looking for food. Some of those people that were to come along would be Joseph's family, all right, the direct descendants of Abraham. This group of people would now live in Egypt, and as they lived in Egypt, their numbers began to grow. And over the course of many years, they became a very powerful group of people. There were hundreds of thousands of them. The Egyptians saw this power. They saw the numbers of those from the line of Abraham. And so they took this entire group of people and enslaved them in Egypt. Now, these Israelites, the line of Abraham, would be in slavery for over 400 years until a man named Moses would come along. Now, Moses would be used of God to set the people free. The Israelites would be set free through, if you know the stories, there's all kinds of crazy stuff that happens with the plagues and all that good stuff. So now God uses Moses to help set these people free. After they are set free, they leave Egypt, and it's at this moment that for the first time, we see God give actual written down laws. And so through Moses, God gives the law, and also on top of the law, he also gives the sacrificial system. Now, with the law, the idea was God gave a bunch of different rules that the Israelites were to follow. These rules initially were given because, if you can imagine, the Israelites who had been in captivity for over 400 years are now free and really have no idea how to develop a healthy community because they have been in captivity their entire lives. And so they needed a structure so that they could have a healthy community that would eventually grow into a nation. And so God gives them this law so that they have structure. The idea, though, is that they had to follow these laws perfectly or it was sin. They would be going against the law of God, against the commands of God. And because of their sin, again, we are all sinful, God institutes this sacrificial system where, because of our sin, something must die. Ultimately, because of our sin, we ourselves are under the wrath and judgment of God. But what God does is he institutes the sacrificial system so that once a year an animal was killed, its blood was shed for the remission of sin. Now, some would ask, well, why would God require blood to be spilled and death in order to find remission of sin? Well, the reason is this. God hates sin so much, he needed us to understand just how big of a deal it is. And blood and death really shakes us. It is not something that we are just cool with seeing. When we see blood and death, it disturbs us. And God needed us to understand just how disturbing our sin really was. And so God institutes this death, this blood that must be spilled so that you and I get it. You know, when we sin, when we lie, or when we steal, or when we're mean, we're like, it's no big deal. But to God, it's a big deal. And so he institutes this idea of blood and death. Now, this would happen for many, many years. Right? There would be people after people after people attempting to follow this law. There would be animal after animal that would be killed. And it would be done over and over again. But it was done over and over again because it was never good enough. Nobody ever could follow the law perfectly. Nobody ever could provide a perfect sacrifice. It was simply a temporary fix. It was not a permanent solution. And it's in this time that you're going to see a lot of the really famous Bible stories. Right? During this time period, you've got stories like David and Goliath and Jonah and the whale and Daniel and the lions. And it's during all of this time that you're going to begin to see a lot of those famous stories. And these stories will just continue to happen. You'll see the different prophets coming through. Israel will be going through this weird cycle where they're obedient and then they're disobedient and then they're punished. But then they come back to God and they're obedient again. But then they're disobedient again. And over again, you see Israel going through this. And over again, you're going to actually start to see them conquered by other nations, taken over, one of which would eventually be the Roman Empire, who would come in and occupy Israel. They would take over Jerusalem so that now the Romans are in control of Israel. And it's in this moment that then you see Jesus being born. Right? Now, Jesus would come. He would be born of a virgin. The Holy Spirit would come and give Mary, the Virgin Mary, Jesus. Important that we just stop here and understand this, that this is important because Jesus now is not given a sinful nature because he has no physical ties to Adam. All right? So now Jesus is born without this sinful nature. When he is born and he lives a life of perfection. He is without sin. He follows the law absolutely perfectly, and now becomes the only person, except for Adam originally, who ever had a perfect unity with God because he was without sin. This is an important piece because Jesus would not only die in our place, but he'll also live in our place. And so Jesus' perfect life was lived on our behalf. But we know that Jesus does not only live, he also would eventually go to the cross and would die. On the cross, he takes our sin, our shame. He takes the wrath of God upon himself on the cross so that now he takes our death, he takes our sin, and he gives us his perfect life. So that now when God sees us, he does not see a sinful, vile person. Instead, he sees the perfection of Jesus. So Jesus lives for us. He dies for us. He goes to the grave. Ultimately, though, we know that the grave could not hold him down, and he would eventually, 3 days later, rise again. When he rises again, he will eventually conquer sin, right? He conquers sin, which was placed on him on the cross. He conquers death, which put him in the grave, so that now he has complete victory, and all those that follow him find victory over sin, over death. Jesus would rise again. He would ascend to the Father. He would go back to where he came, and it would be here that Jesus now rules and reigns over all, giving a promise to those that are still left here, that there is hope for a future. And one day, we see in Revelation 21, that one day God will bring a new heaven and a new earth, where which we will all together live in perfect unity once again with the God that created us. There's the grand narrative of Scripture. Everything before Jesus is leading to Jesus. Everything after Jesus is because of Jesus. The entire book is about Jesus. Okay? Everything before Jesus is leading to Jesus. Everything after Jesus is because of Jesus. The entire book is about Jesus. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, you've got Adam and Eve, perfect harmony with God. It is in this moment that we see Jesus, just like original Adam, having a perfect unity with God, except Jesus does something that Adam was not able to do. He remained faithful to the call of God. He was obedient and perfect. And so what Jesus does is he hits the reset button on humanity so that now Jesus becomes the new Adam, our new Adam. Now this is where our nature will now come from Jesus. Instead of Adam, Jesus is the greater Adam. Okay? Then you've got Jesus and Abraham. There's just an amazing connection between Jesus and Abraham. Jesus, just like Abraham, was a man of great faith. Ultimately, when God promised Abraham that the nations will be blessed through your line, he was referring to Jesus. Jesus would be the one that would come, and now salvation is available to all nations, to the entire world. All people are blessed through Jesus, who ultimately ended up coming from the line of Abraham. So that now we see this direct connection between Abraham and Jesus. Additionally, I told you the story about Abraham and Isaac. Abraham takes Isaac up to sacrifice him. God stops him, and God says to Abraham, "Now I know you love me because you did not withhold your one and only son from me." Now we can say in Jesus, we can say to God the Father, "Now I know that you love me because you did not withhold your one and only son from me." Jesus is directly connected to Abraham and Isaac. Then you've got the law and the sacrificial system. The law was given. Jesus lived it out perfectly. Without fail, was without sin. He became perfection. Therefore, causing him to become a perfect sacrifice. He was without sin, and so when he goes to the cross, he is an absolutely perfect sacrifice. He fulfills the law for us. He becomes our sacrifice. Then you've got all the famous stories. I just showed you how all of these famous stories point us ultimately to Jesus and show us this grand narrative, even within these subplots. Then you've got Jesus, who eventually would rise again. When he rises again, he undoes what happened at the tree, and he undoes the darkness and the death that is now within us. And so what we see now is even at the tomb, Jesus undoing what happened all the way back in Genesis. They are directly connected. Jesus undoes the sin at the tree and the death that resulted. Jesus fixes it. You've got Jesus as he ascends now to the Father. You've got Jesus who now becomes, as the glorified one that rose again, now becomes our mediator. He becomes the greater Moses because Moses spoke to the people, God spoke to Moses, who then spoke to the people. Jesus now becomes our greater mediator, who is now between us and the Father and mediating between us and him. Jesus becomes our priest. He becomes our prophet. He becomes our greater Moses. Ultimately, Jesus will eventually be the one that returns, ushering in this new heaven and this new earth, undoing what happened to creation all the way back in Genesis, and we will eventually live forever with him. All of this, do you see how this is all connected to Jesus? Everything comes back to Christ.